Hello, everyone. Bill Hood with the Trucking MBA and Velocity Group. And tonight, get started here. Yesterday, I posted put on Facebook talking about profits and how do drivers look at their profits? Is it on a per load basis, on a per week, per month, the year? What are they? How are they functioning? What are they doing as they go through things? So we're gonna wait a couple minutes here. It's funny. If you hear some noises going on, I apologize. We are actually moving this weekend and today, and my wife always always calls when I'm doing something like this, and she's calling right there. Um, so she always accused me. There's been a couple times where, like the full move, I've been on business trips and been away, and I've done very little of the move. So tonight I'm going to keep just about 30 minutes. Phone stop ringing, and we'll get through and hammer it out. Probably maybe get most of the stuff moved tonight. So yeah. So the question that we threw out was profit per load. Do you look at per day, or is it weekly cash flow? And as I've said in some of the other shows I'm doing, that what I'm what I'd like to be able to do is open a discussion more than what you just get in sound bites on Facebook or Twitter or just some comments there. And there are others that are doing events like this or these types of shows and talking about the business and trucking on Facebook, and hopefully work with them and have a back and forth dialogue and raise people's awareness about the business side of trucking. So with this here is making this post. I'm going to read a couple of these here. It's some of these are really really interesting when you dig down into some of this stuff. Um, I think one of the other things that's interesting about this is the people who actually post. There are been in this section as far as Facebook and uh, social media for quite some time, and there's a core group of people that I would say are business minded that post, and then there's another core group that keep pretty quiet to themselves, and I actually got more private messages uh, yesterday or last night after I posted this. I was up to about midnight responding to people. Um, then I think I actually got different people who posted on the um, on the thread, which is interesting. So it tells you there's a lot of people who are looking out there, called the lurkers, but they really don't want to put things out there. A lot of the comments I get from people were around uh, things around not being always being the bashing the rate per miles and things like that. And that's being profit per mile, and how to build to get a better revenue. Really are some of the things that they're trying to be able to do for themselves. So I'm going to read. Well, I'm going to paraphrase here as far as one conversation saying, right now, I pretty much always focus on rate per mile, and I don't drop below a certain level. If I do, I will drive empty. I know in my heart that I'm probably making a lot of mistakes and leaving money on the table. But so far this year, the money's been so good that it is not something that I'm feeling that it is a acute pressure until that was in capitalized until this past month. It became harder and harder, and I probably made 10 times as many calls before I could even get something close to the rate I wanted. And I probably drove empty more than I'd like to. I just this past week got my profit and loss statement from my accounting for last month. And for the first time in this business, I lost money. So, what do I focus on? Obviously, the wrong things because I made no profit last month. What can I do differently? And we went on and we talked about some of the different things that you need to focus on. So that's what we want to talk about. Frank Griffin, who's Frank Griffin, by the way, is on Facebook quite a bit. He's a broker and he also owns trucks and runs trucks, so he knows both sides of it. Um, and as he says, it starts with the load becomes the week becomes the month becomes the year, and it could give. If he could give anyone advice, he'd say run the lanes you know both out and back, build relationships with your customers, brokers, give great service, and enjoy the ride. That probably sums up so much of probably what I like to tell people as far as know your lanes, make sure you build relationships, and make sure that you're having fun in what you're doing. And you can see a lot of people out there that don't talk or don't focus on the right things. They focus on negative things. You wonder about how much fun. We're not the ones posting on this. People who I don't recognize posting a lot, we're making posts. So it's interesting the different types of posts or people who will post on certain things. So focusing on, and by the way, if you're checking in here, go ahead and comments and questions. I've got the comment section right up here in front of me. But so the question about what you're focusing on, don't get me wrong, gross revenue, which is basically, whether you're measuring it by the load, by the day, or by the mile, rate per mile is gross revenue. It's gross revenue per mile is what you're generating. So if you're focusing on your gross revenue per mile, per day, per week, per load, whatever it happens to be, gross revenue is only one factor. And it's something that you do need to focus on. But unfortunately, I think out there right now, far too many people focus on just that gross revenue number and that rate per mile number, and they're not focusing on the profit. One of the problems I think that we see a lot out there on when we talk about trying to focus on the profit is when you take a look at profit per mile, no one can tell you on Monday morning when they start to pull out for their load what their cost per mile is going to be for that week. It's a variable number, even when you know your fixed expenses. It's a variable number. So it's very difficult to be able to, with any amount of accuracy, to be able to know what the profit's going to be on any particular load, because it could be, if you're looking at it from a weekly perspective, because it could be that um, there are you don't run as many miles as you expect. And so your fixed cost divided into the number of miles divided into your fixed cost increases your cost per mile. One of the areas I want people not to get away from understanding the general area of your cost per mile to help you gauge an index of your rate per mile, but also to get to understand what your daily fixed costs are. Build a budget based on, let's say, 300 miles a day, if that's your average. So if you go 5 days a week at 300 miles a day and you build all your variable costs based on that, and you come up with a number. So now you have your business expense. And then and this is where I've changed over the years in terms of and this is where we talk about as far as coming after profits. And then what you look to do. So let's say your business expense, 300 miles, putting money in the maintenance account, everything that you're supposed to be doing. So let's say you're $500 as far as a day. That is your running 300 miles. That's your cost, and maybe it's 325 is your fix. If the truck just sits, it's going to cost you $325 a day. So if we have that $500 number that we're going with, we'll use that as our example here, and then go in and figure out what your profit per day needs to be to cover your personal life. This is the income. This is the profit piece. So what we're doing is we're generating a minimum gross revenue per day that you need to generate to cover all your truck expenses, all your variable expenses based on 300 miles, and then all your personal expenses. So you're building in that how much you need to make. So let's say you need make $300 a day is what it comes back. And I'm going to put a link to one of the videos, and we're going to have some more stuff coming out that um, that just digs into how to build a budget on a minimum gross revenue per day uh, target that we have there. So you have your minimum gross revenue per day. Now you have something when you're taking a look at loads, and you can gauge between, is this load that's going to generate $1,000 and it's, let's say it's 300 miles, so it fits right in there, and your minimum gross revenue per day is $800. Great. You know what? That is going to work within you. Lots of other things that go into here. I know you got to know the markets, because maybe that $1,000 is below the market rate. So they're still being able to know the market. But what we're looking at here, and what I'm talking about as far as looking at this, is if you start to understand some of those numbers, you start to understand the impact of things like sitting or deadheading because a rate is too low. Once you start having, you realize that at $800, you realize you need 4,000 gross revenue per week on a 5-day week, that if you miss a day, you've all of a sudden, instead of $800 a day as your minimum gross revenue, you have to do $1,000 per day in order to make up for that day. Now, sometimes, hopefully, if everything's going well and you're negotiating well and your costs, those personal and business costs, are under control, because you want that number to be as low as possible, right? So hopefully, if you're doing well, you may have the opportunity where you're looking at it and you're saying, hey, you know what? I'm sitting at $4,500 this week and it's Thursday morning. I don't see anything any good. I'm going to drive and pick something up Thursday night or Friday morning. I can afford this. That could be a decision that you make. Unfortunately, what people are doing that are focused on the gross revenue number or the rate per mile revenue number is they're not pulling into account what they need to generate in order to cover all their personal and business expenses. And what we saw back in 2014, well, really come back in 2015, is when the market changed, is that we saw the second half of 2015 and 2016 a record number of owner operators going out of business. And most of them went out of business because of maintenance issues, not being able to take care of maintenance. Talking to somebody last night on the chat, we were talking about that, and his father is a diesel mechanic, works for a Freightliner dealership, and they were talking about that a couple of years ago. And what his father saw was that in 2015, there were a lot of not just individual owner operators, but a lot of carriers who basically didn't do general preventative maintenance. It was one of those things. If it's not broken down, maybe we can, if your cycle's 20,000, maybe we can push it to 30, 35. But it was always a crunch because the revenue wasn't there. Now, there are a couple reasons around where that revenue was coming from and not coming from. One was people were focused on the rate per mile, not focused on what they needed to generate. So what didn't happen, and we saw this, is they didn't pivot. So let's say you have somebody who was making a just loving life, running a 200-mile, 400-mile round trip for $1,000. They would go out, they'd come back empty, be home at night, do it again the next day. Every day they could get one of those loads. Maybe if they got lucky, they'd get a load back that worked perfect, but they just knew if they got back to town, they had that $1,000 the next day, and they were generating 5,000 gross revenue per week minimum. Well, they're looking at their, $5 per mile freight, $2.50 all miles. Man, that's good. You know what? They're doing a good job there, and half of it being empty, so their fuel costs were down. Come 2015, now $2.50, especially on those short loads, wasn't available. It wasn't there. You were seeing those loads being picked up for $400, $500. And what was happening is these people who got into that mode, number one, when they were making the money, they didn't pay down their expenses and reduce their expenses. Number two, they sat. They wanted that $2.50 a mile. What they really needed to focus on once that market turned is they needed to, if they recognized that they needed $800 gross revenue per day and they weren't going to get it doing what they were doing before, they need to find a different lane or another market or do something else. And I know that's a tough thing for a lot of people to get and to understand. But if you're a business owner and you are going to be in this for the long haul and you want to be successful with this, then you need to do the things like that that will allow you to be successful. Sometimes you have to make the hard choices. I know from my perspective, when I first got into this and I had a truck, I think there's like what was it? It was like July through January. I was actually home only 5 nights. Now, I hated it. It's not something I wanted to do, but it was what I had to do in order to produce the income I needed to pay for the things that my family needed and pay for the truck and everything else. It was just because of the market at that time, what was happening. It was something I needed to do. Now, I was fortunate enough to be able to get into a better um, situation where there was less wear and tear and those types of things, be able to move into it. So while I was doing what I didn't necessarily want to do, I was constantly on the search for something that would fit better for me. Um, so that's where we come down. Are you looking at the profit on a daily, weekly, monthly basis? If if you don't know what profit you need and you don't have realistic expectations, and trust me, there are two numbers, right? Everyone should probably have two numbers. You have the minimum. I cannot be in this business if I don't make X. That's the number you want. You want your fixed cost, an estimated or a variable based on a number you know. So 300 miles, you know that number. If it's a 400-mile load, you should know the number that you just add on to that. So let's say it's $50 for an extra 100 miles. So now you're looking at, okay, 850 is my minimum. Makes it very easy, very quick to understand the numbers and where you're at. So, okay, you have $800 that you need to generate every single day. And if all of a sudden the lane you're running doesn't hit that number and you can't do that, you need to be able to take a look and say, okay, what else can I do right now that is going to generate me $800 a day? And maybe that's going to be a 500-mile load. So now it goes to $900 a day. Well, can I do $900 a day in this lane? Yes or no? You have to start looking for the other options, because what's going to happen is you are not going to have the choice if you keep spending. What's happening is it's almost like every day that you miss your number, you're having to write a check for that. Imagine if it's like, okay, I need $800 a day, and I've got to pay the bank $800 every single day for my truck and my personal life. And I've got so much money sitting out over here, right? This is my pool of money to play with. We want this pool of money to grow, right? We don't want this to shrink. Um, so if, let's say you sit and you don't run, you write a check and you write a check and you hand that off to the bank for your $800 a day, and you take this out of your pool of money and you pay that. The next day, maybe you get a 500-mile because, hey, you know what? It pays my $2.50 a mile number that I have to hit. You get $500. Well, now you just wrote a check for $300, and you do that too many times. Then what happens is you don't have a pile of money anymore. And unfortunately, for most of the owner operators out there, their pile of money is not actually actual money. It's that maybe they got $150 per day in their budget in that $800 for their maintenance, or they should. That gets ignored, because I tell you, mama's still going to get her money to pay the house payment and feed the kids and clothe the kids, and when you come home, go out, for dinner. um, that's got to happen, right? That's going to happen. There's not going to be changes there. You still got to pay the truck insurance. You still got to pay the fuel bill. You still got to pay the truck note if you have one. All these things need to happen. So where we all know that, hey, that big expense is going to come up. That money's not being put in there. So when you're writing the check, sometimes you're borrowing from that. You're borrowing from the future problems that you're going to have with your truck because you're not putting that money aside. So by not knowing those numbers what happened and what we saw in 2015 and what will happen again when the market turns, and I'm not saying it's going to turn right now, is your gross revenue number, that index, that $2.50 or $2 per mile or whatever it is you say is your minimum number that you're going to haul for, may not generate enough revenue for you to actually pay your bills, not give you enough profit. Now, there are lots of ways to look at profit. Yes, you can. I also like some people's ideas of uh, that you have you kind of build a number. One guy says, well, I budget everything based on 1,500 miles a week. Um, but the one thing he missed is he ran 52 weeks a year, and truck doesn't run 52 weeks a year. But he saw that. He said, wow, yeah, that's a mistake. And he brought it down to the 46 weeks. I think he went to 44 weeks is what he thought is he would like to do. But he had, based on 1,500 miles per week at a fuel cost based on then without the discount, he was getting a pretty hefty discount, anywhere from 30 to 40 cents a gallon. So he built in a lot of slop into his expenses, and he knew he needed to run 1,500 miles a week, and how much he needed to make on 1,500 miles per week in order to pay his personal bills. So he had that down, right? So for him, he always knew that one is if maybe he only ran 1,500 miles a week, maybe 3 days or 4 days in the week, he was not putting himself in a hole. And typically he was running 22 to 2,500 miles a week, and he was still hitting from that inflated cost per mile number that he was using. He was still hitting the profit per mile number that he needed based on that, even running over 2,000 miles per week. So he knew, without doing any math, he knew that he was making not just what he needed, he was making more. And what he did that was very smart was he used $125 a day that he put into a maintenance account. He only spent the profit that he built, that he said he had to build in there on stuff. Anything that came out because the extra from, let's say it was $1.50 and he ran 2,000, so it took it down to $1.25. So there was 25 cents extra mile that went into his maintenance account. Anything that he calculated as far as on the above side, want to pay down debt. Now, that was the illustration that he used as far as how he made sure that he put himself in a strong financial position. I'm guessing he probably didn't do all those calculations. He just knew that, let's say he needed $1 per mile, he needed $1,500 a week. So anything left over after $1,500 a week and pulling the expenses that were put away in reserves went to maintenance reserves and paying down debt. People with that mindset, these are the people that pay cash for an overhaul. These are the people who look at after July 4th saying, you know what? Yep, it's another July. The market's tanked. I've been running hard because the rates have been great. I've been blowing my numbers out with all this. I got enough money banked and set aside that I'm gonna go and I'm gonna shut down for a couple of weeks and just kind of not frustrate myself with what the rates and the lack of loads are out there. And then maybe, after a couple of weeks, as far as come back in and maybe sit on the couch and wait for that perfect load that actually pays a little better, because we all know that does happen. So, but the whole key around all this is knowing those expense numbers and where you need to be as far as in profit. Some people will say, hey, they build their, I got to get 60 cents per mile in order for it to be worth it for me to be an owner operator. That's wonderful. Great. You get 60 cents per mile. The problem comes in is if that 60 cents per mile is based on 2,500 miles a week, and that's what you need in order to pay your bills. What happens when you have a 2,000-mile week or you have back-to-back 1,500-mile weeks? But if you knew that 60 cents per mile is $1,200 a week is what you need to generate in order to pay your bills, now you can start looking at things differently. It's like, oh, I'm getting a little shy this week as far as hitting the number. I need to run maybe a little harder. Or you know what? I made 2,200 clear last week. I'm not real stressed about this week because I'm already ahead of the game. And there are ups and downs. It's like any business. I'm going to kind of wrap this up here in saying that there are. Hi, Lauren.
I need the credit card.
So I'm going to wrap this up here and say there are a lot of people out there that are so focused on the rate per mile that they end up putting themselves out of business because they're not focused on profit per mile, profit per day, profit per week. That you're in business for profits, and that's what you need to focus on. Thank you very much. There'll be some notes and comments in the bottom. Thank you.
No, you don't get to do this.